Hello YouTube community and fantasy footballers all across the world. My name is Justin Medeiros III and this is my YouTube channel. And today I would like to talk to you about my top 10 running backs. And I would like to know what you think. Leave in the comments if you agree with my top 10 list, if you disagree, if you feel like some players should be higher. And also, this is my first video on YouTube, especially with my face in the camera, so any tips or tricks that you could give me as far as how I could improve my videos or what I should cut out. But without further ado, today's video will be the top 10 running backs on my board, and next week hopefully I'll come up with the next 10 and the next 10 until I get to my top 40 running backs, and then I'll move on to my top 40 wide receivers. So without further ado, number one is Christian McCaffrey, of course. He had 287 rushing attempts for 1,387 rushing yards and 15 rushing touchdowns, with an additional 116 receptions for 1,005 yards and 4 touchdowns. So he had 1,000 yards rushing, 1,000 yards receiving. So that's pretty incredible. There's only been a handful of guys in NFL history that have done that. So he had an amazing season last year, and ESPN Fantasy Football League total points he scored was 471.2 for 2019, and the ESPN Fantasy Football app has projected for him to score 334.3 points in 2020, which is a decrease of 140 points, which is pretty substantial, but he outscored the next highest running back by 170 points last year. So if he takes a drop of 140 points this year, then he'll still outscore the next highest running back by 30 some odd fantasy points, according to the ESPN Fantasy Football. Draft round, I think he should go first overall. There's nobody in fantasy football that'll score more points than him throughout the season. So that's my take on him. Some of his pros are what I had already mentioned. He outscored the next closest running back in 2019 by 156 fantasy points. He was on the field for 93% of the offensive snaps, and he rushed and received for 1,000 yards. The only cons for him I put were that he has a new head coach, an inexperienced head coach, and a new quarterback in Teddy Bridgewater, which could be a blessing if they decide to run more read option plays or more gimmick type of stuff, jet sweeps, things like that. It could be a blessing for him, but I feel like a new quarterback learning a new system might be a little hard. And his offensive line isn't the best, but that didn't stop him last year. So I had a hard time finding cons for Christian McCaffrey. So I only really see upside with him. If he has a lesser year this year, he'll still probably be a top 3 running back. So what I like to do is get averages. So I don't like to look at only his season as a whole. I like to look at all players' seasons and take averages. So for example, Christian McCaffrey's average rushing attempts per game was 17.93, which shows that the Panthers obviously will use him in the running game. If you're a running back that gets close to 20 carries a game, you're a workhorse. So the more carries you get per game, obviously the more rushing yards, more rushing touchdowns you're likely to get. So obviously I like to see an average of what he has, 17.93, around 18 carries a game. His average rushing yards per game was 86.68 yards per game. Average receptions per game was pretty crazy at 7.25, so 7.25 receptions per game, which is pretty nuts because most running backs average about 3 receptions per game. So he doubled that. Average receiving yards per game was 62.81, so he averaged 60 yards rushing or receiving a game, and he had 19 total touchdowns, and he had an average fantasy football points per week of 26.9, which is pretty nuts because if you had Christian McCaffrey in your lineup, he was almost guaranteed to score you 26.9 points. Like, you could count on him to give you close to 27 points a week. So you just plug him in your lineup and you just leave him there. Every week, you know, he'll get you between 20 to 30 points. My next guy is Saquon Barkley, which I could have put Zeke here, but I feel like Saquon might have more upside, and I'll discuss why in the next section. But his statistics were 217 rushing attempts for 1,003 yards and 6 touchdowns. He contributed 52 receptions for 438 yards and 2 touchdowns. And ESPN Fantasy Football League total points last year was 244.1. And ESPN Fantasy Football League projection has him scoring 290.1 this season in 2020. And his draft round is first round. He'll probably be a top 3 pick. So his pros, Saquon Barkley's pros would be that he should be fully healthy heading into this year, which he missed a couple games last year due to injury. I feel like Jason Garrett coming over as the offensive coordinator is going to help him out substantially, because when Jason Garrett was with the Dallas Cowboys, he built one really good offensive line for them and then drafted an elite running back in Zeke. And Jason Garrett has a 60-40 run to pass ratio offense. So I feel like Jason Garrett likes to run the ball to then set up the pass. So I feel like a guy like Saquon Barkley will be utilized to his highest potential in that offense. Maybe not in the passing game. Jason Garrett's offense isn't the most creative, but he loves to run his running backs into the ground and then keep running them. So another pro would be the Giants in this year's draft drafted left tackle Andrew Thomas and offensive guard Matt Pert, which will help solidify the offensive line. So 2 years ago in the second round, they took Will Hernandez, a bulldozer at left guard. Then this year they grab a left tackle and Andrew Thomas, who is quite a mammoth himself, especially in the run game. So it seems like they're taking steps to solidify the offensive line. The cons, I just feel like he doesn't stay healthy. Obviously his production will drop this year. And I feel like without having, too many receiving threats, like they have Golden Tate and Sterling Shepard, and those guys are manageable. They're pretty good receivers in the NFL, but I feel like most teams will go into the season looking to stop the run first and then trying to avoid the pass secondary. Like I feel like most defensive coordinators will load the box to stop Saquon, and then if they beat them with the receivers they have, then they'll live with that, but they don't want Saquon running all over them. So in summary, his averages were he averaged 16.69 rushing attempts per game. He averaged 77.15 rushing yards per game. Averaged 4 receptions per game, 33.69 receiving yards per game, and 8 total touchdowns for an average fantasy football score of 19.23 points per week. So similar to Christian McCaffrey, he'll give you close to 20 points a week, and he's pretty consistent. I feel like this year his scores will go up because he's finally healthy. He has an offensive coordinator that loves to run the ball, and so I feel like you'll have a lot better year out of Saquon than he did last year. So my third guy is Ezekiel Elliott, who I'm a huge fan of, a diehard Dallas Cowboys fan, so I love Zeke. But I had him at number 3 because I'm kind of concerned about what Mike McCarthy's going to do with that offense. If he's just going to spread them out and just throw the ball left and right, or if he's actually going to utilize Zeke. It's just you never know when you have a new offensive-minded coach that didn't traditionally have league-leading rushers when he was with the Packers, coming to the Cowboys with league-leading rusher in Ezekiel Elliott. You just wonder how much of his production will drop. So he had 301 attempts, 1,357 yards rushing, and 12 touchdowns rushing. He also contributed 54 receptions for 420 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he scored a total of 311.7 points in ESPN Fantasy Football last year, and ESPN is projecting him to score 20 less points at 297 points in 2020, which would put him at the second highest projected points total in 2020, and he is definitely a first round pick, obviously top 3 with Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley. His pros are his best ability is availability, so having a running back that you can count on to play for you every single week is amazing. Like, you don't have to worry if Zeke's going to be out there or not. You plug him in your lineup, he'll be there every week except for the bye. Can absorb contact and fall forward. That's one of Zeke's best traits, is even if he gets stopped at the line of scrimmage, he'll fall forward for 1 or 2 yards. yards. So I feel like that helps him close to the goal line, contributing towards more touchdowns, obviously. And he still has a stellar offensive line. Even though losing Travis Fredericks, they have Joe Looney that can start at center if he needs to. And he did pretty good for them when Travis Fredericks was out dealing with his illness. And they drafted Tyler Biotish from Wisconsin in the 4th round, who could potentially fight for a starting job. So the cons are the new head coach, who likes to pass to set up the run, which is what I talked about earlier in Mike McCarthy as compared to Jason Garrett. I feel like he needs to work on his breakaway speed. He doesn't run away from defenders as much as he used to in his rookie year, but that's something that he can work on, obviously. And one other thing that I'm concerned about is with all the perimeter weapons that the Cowboys have now in Michael Gallup emerging as a 1,000-yard receiver, and Amari Cooper, who's going to get his targets every game, and with the drafting of CeeDee Lamb in the 1st round of this year's draft to compete for outside or slot work. They might be in 11 personnel on 80% of their snaps, which would be ridiculous. I understand that, but I mean, they have a tight end now in Blake Jarwin, who's not much of a blocker, more of a pass catching tight end. So I'm more so worried that the Cowboys offense might lean more towards passing first and running second, which is fine for Ezekiel Elliott if he gets used in the screen game more often and things like that. But right now I'm just concerned that there's going to be too many mouths to feed on that offense, and they might be more concerned about getting 10 targets for all of their receivers and not as worried about getting Zeke his 30 touches a game. And his summary is he averaged 18.81 rushing attempts per game. He averaged 84.81 rushing yards a game. He had 3.37 receptions a game. He averaged 26.25 receiving yards per game, and he had a total of 14 touchdowns, which gave him an average fantasy football points per week of 19.91, which is amazing. It's 20 points per week. You put Zeke in your lineup, you can already put 20 points on the scoreboard already. So another great guy to have. Coming in at number 4, I have Dalvin Cook, which might be a surprise to some people. Other fantasy football podcasts, people that I've watched, have him in the teens, or some guys that are real haters, they have him in the 20s. I have him at number 4 because merely his statistics, and I thought he finally lived up to the hype last year. I feel like his whole career he was hyped up, and then last year he finally broke out. I still wish he would have stayed healthy for the entire season, but his season was a lot better than I expected when I drafted him last year. He had 250 rushing attempts for 1,135 yards and 13 rushing touchdowns. He had 53 receptions for 519 yards and 0 touchdowns, which was unfortunate, but he made up for it with the rushing touchdowns total. He scored 292.4 points in ESPN Fantasy Football last year in total throughout the whole season. And this year he's projected to score 1 less point at 291.4 in 2020. So I feel like he is definitely worth drafting in the 1st round, in the top 5 maybe. The injury issues are a big concern, but I feel like if he has another season like he did last year, then it was well worth it. I got him in the 2nd round last year, and I was insanely pleased. The outlook on Dalvin Cook is he finally lived up to the draft hype, which I talked about earlier. Is very explosive and can take any pass or run 80 yards to the end zone. So no matter where he gets handed the ball, he has the speed and athleticism to take it to the house. And he's a dual threat running back with soft hands and can break tackles. So he's a complete back. His cons are health, and health. Every year he has been hampered with injuries, and that's the only thing that's brought down his production. And another con is the Vikings are rebuilding on defense this year. So if the defense gives up a lot of points, then they might not, they're not playing with the lead, so they're not trying to kill the clock, so they're not trying to hand off the ball that frequently. So I'm concerned that if the Vikings defense this year is crappy, then he might not get as many carries a game as as he did last year. Hopefully, if they're playing from behind, they're throwing him the ball more frequently, so I wouldn't mind those receptions in PPR leagues. So his summary are: he averaged 17.85 rushing attempts per game, averaged 81 rushing yards per game, he averaged 37 receiving yards a game, and he averaged almost 4 receptions per game with a total touchdowns of 13 and an average fantasy football points per game of 21.31, which to me was pretty astonishing when I seen that number, because that's second to Christian McCaffrey. So he had the second highest average behind Christian McCaffrey, above Saquon, above Zeke, Alvin Kamara, all these guys. So I feel like a lot of guys were sleeping on Dalvin Cook last year, and he showed out, and I ended up in the playoffs because I had Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry on my roster, and they both blew up last year, and they both averaged above 20 points per week, which was amazing. So I feel like he's definitely worth drafting again this year, and you just hope and pray he doesn't get injured. So coming in at number 5, I got my main man Derrick Henry. He's a beast. I love this guy. He had 303 rushing attempts for 1,540 yards and 16 rushing touchdowns. He also had 18 receptions, 206 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He scored a total of 294.6 fantasy points last year, according to ESPN Fantasy Football. And this year he's projected to score 40 points less at 254.8. But I don't necessarily see it. He could, because he had a lot less receptions than a lot of the other receivers. Dalvin Cook, even Zeke. Zeke is a guy that I don't think is utilized in the passing game as much as he should be, but he had 54 receptions as compared to Derrick Henry's 18 receptions. So in a PPR league, he is worrisome because he only had 18 receptions, but if the production he gives you on the ground makes up for it. So I have him going in the first round. I would say he's a top 10 player. That's just my personal opinion. Obviously, I could be biased because how amazing he played for me in a couple leagues last year, but I feel like he's first round quality. The outlook for him, I put that he's built like a tank. He's 6'3", 247 pounds, and he's durable, and he takes hits and keeps coming back for more. Like, the first guy never takes him down. He stiff arms defenders' souls from their bodies. He's just a monster. He's a Mack truck with shoulder pads. He had amazing production on the ground. So he had at least 20 carries a game, which was what you look for in a running back. The cons that I have is that he lost a really solid piece on his offensive line in right tackle Jack Conklin, and so that kind of weakens the offensive line a little bit. I put he's not a pass catching threat, which is obviously really concerning in PPR leagues, but if he gives you the production on the ground, then it doesn't matter. And I put, is he a possible contract holdout? I don't think so. There's no reports coming out that he will be holding out, waiting for a larger contract. He seems right now content being franchise tagged and working on a new deal. And now his summary and averages. He averaged 20.2 rushing attempts per game. He averaged 102.66 rushing yards a game. He averaged 102 rushing yards a game. That's ridiculous. To be a 1,000-yard rusher, you need to average around 60 yards a game, and he averaged 102. However, he averaged 1.2 receptions per game, which, like I said, in a PPR league, you obviously want that bumped up at least 2 or 3 more receptions per game. And his receiving yards per game was 13.73, which was also horrible. But like I said, he made up for it on the ground. He had 18 total touchdowns, and his average fantasy football points per week was above 20 at 20.37. So he actually had third average highest, only behind Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook in average points per week. So another guy, you draft him, you put him in your lineup, 20 points per week. There you go. So the next guy we have is number 6, and that is Alvin Kamara. I feel like he had quite a down year, and I feel like he will bounce back. But last year, like, I can't put him in the top 5 with the season he had last year. He only had 171 rushing attempts for 797 yards and 5 touchdowns. He did did have 81 receptions for 533 yards and 1 touchdown. So he was used an insane amount in the passing game. He had like wide receiver 2 or 3 numbers as a running back. So his total fantasy points last year were 248.52 according to ESPN Fantasy Football, and this year they project him to score 40 more points at 287.4 in 2020. I feel like he's still a first round player. I feel like he should have a much better year on the ground. That is, if Drew Brees doesn't target Michael Thomas 600 times again this season. I feel like they underutilized him last year, and they should get back to feeding him the ball 20 to 30 times a game like they usually do. So I put his outlook was that he was targeted in the passing game like a number 2 receiver. So in PPR leagues, that's huge. Like if you get a point per reception, then he's making you points through the air. And then I put he averaged 4.7 yards per carry. So if he's used more this year in the running game, his yards and touchdowns should go up considerably. So that's what I was stating earlier. If they actually used him more on the ground, then he would have significantly higher points. And I put he scored 4 touchdowns in the final 2 games of the season. So when they actually started utilizing him more, he scored 4 touchdowns in 2 games. So he averaged 2 touchdowns a game. So when you actually use him, he scores. So use him. His cons were he dealt with minor injuries last year, but nothing significant. Was used very sparingly on the goal line and had 6 total touchdowns on the season, which you'd like to see a lot higher. Derrick Henry had 19, Dalvin Cook had 18. It's like, so to only have 6 touchdowns on the season, that's not the best. And he only averaged 12.2 carries a game. So that's you want that number closer to 20 than closer to 10. Like that's too low for a starting running back. So obviously his average rushing attempts per game is 12.21. His average rushing yards per game were 56.92, which I'd like to see that closer to 70 or 80 yards rushing a game. Average receptions per game was really high at 5.78, so almost 7 receptions per game, which is, if you're in a 1-point PPR league, that's 6 points guaranteed just for catching the ball. He averaged 38.07 receiving yards per game, and he had 6 total touchdowns. So he averaged on the season, his average fantasy football points per game was 17.75 points. That's still pretty good. That's decent, but it's not 20 points per game. It's not somebody that you feel ultra confident about every single week. Like if he's your RB1, then you feel kind of good about it, but not ecstatic like you would with Saquon or Zeke or somebody. So coming in at number 7 is going to surprise a lot of people, I am assuming, because of his, like, I haven't seen too many people talking about him this high, is Kenyon Drake. I feel like he has a monster season ahead of him, and I feel like a lot of people are sleeping on him right now. Last year he didn't produce like an RB1, but I feel like this year he has the potential to. So last year he rushed for 170 attempts, 817 yards, and 8 touchdowns. He had 15 receptions for 345 yards and no touchdowns receiving. So he had no receiving touchdowns, 8 total touchdowns rushing. His ESPN Fantasy Football total points last year was 214.2, and ESPN is projecting him to score 251.2 points in 2020. So I feel like he's a second round running back. Like I feel like you should grab him in the second round. Obviously a lot of people out there will probably disagree and say, oh, 3rd, 4th round, or possibly even later. I'm not sure how high everybody else is on Kenyon Drake, but I'm extremely high on him. I did a graph for the points that how productive he was with the Dolphins, how productive he was once he got to the Cardinals. And so when you just look at the Dolphins, he averaged 7.8 rushing attempts per game. So he averaged 8 rushing attempts per game, which is just sad. He averaged 29 rushing yards per game, which is also sad. He averaged 3.6 receptions per game, and he averaged almost 30 receiving yards per game. And however, with the Cardinals, Kenyon Drake average rushing attempts per game was 15. He averaged 80 rushing yards per game, which is really good. He averaged 3.5 receptions per game, which is 0.1 less than with the Dolphins. And he averaged 21 receiving yards per game, which is 8 yards less receiving per game, but he had 8 more touchdowns because he had 0 touchdowns with the Dolphins and 8 with the Cardinals. So on the season, he averaged 15.58 fantasy points per week, but had Kenyon Drake played a full season with the Cardinals, he would have scored 20.42 fantasy points per week. So he would have scored over 20 fantasy points per week. So he's back in the plug him in, leave him there, he'll score you 20 points guaranteed every week. So I got those numbers by, if you use the 8-game averages listed above that Kenyon Drake posted once joining the Arizona Cardinals and expand that sample size to 16 games, his numbers would increase. So had he played a full season with the Arizona Cardinals, he would have had 240 rushing attempts, 1,280 rushing yards, 56 receptions, 336 receiving yards, and 16 total touchdowns. So that was an increase in stats of 70 more rushing attempts, 463 more rushing yards, 6 more receptions. His receiving yards would actually go down by 9 points, but if you're getting 8 more touchdowns and 463 more rushing yards, I don't think you care about 9 less receiving yards. So I'm going off of what he could be in a full season with the Arizona Cardinals, judging off the 8-game stretch he had with them last year. So number 8 is Aaron Jones. I had a real hard time with him because he's such a boom or bust running. His statistics were 236 attempts, 1,084 yards, and 16 rushing touchdowns. His receiving stats were 49 receptions, 474 yards, and 3 touchdowns. So he had 314.8 ESPN fantasy football total points last year. So he had over 300 total points last year, which is phenomenal. 300 points is ridiculous. That's Zeke level production. They project him to score 60 less points this season at 255.1 in 2020, and I feel like he'd be a good guy to have in the second round that you could draft him. In summary, I put that he scored less than 10 points 5 out of 16 weeks. So that's the thing that just scares the life out of me with Aaron Jones is some weeks he might score you 50 points and other weeks he'll score less than 10 points. If you score less than 10 points a third of the season, that kind of scares the life out of me. So I also put he's capable of scoring 50.2 fantasy points like he did week 5 versus the Cowboys, which was a nightmare for me because I played the guy who drafted Aaron Jones, and so he lit me up that week in fantasy, and I had to watch my Cowboys give up that much production to a running back. Like their run defense couldn't stop anything. So he's capable of scoring 50.2 points in a single week, but he's also capable of scoring 3.9 points like he did in week 9 versus the Chargers and 3.8 points like he did week 12 versus San Francisco. His averages per game are average receiving yards per game is 30. His average receptions per game is 3. His average rushing attempts per game is 14.75, and his average rushing yards per game was 67.75. So if you, like I said, if you average around 60 yards a game, then you'll have 1,000 yards rushing at the end of the season. But he averaged 20 fantasy points per week. So that's why he's lower than Alvin Kamara, who averaged 17.75 points per week. And he's lower than Zeke, who had 19.91. He's lower than some of the other guys that I trust more. Aaron Jones is more of a trust issue because I don't trust him to score me 20 fantasy points per week. He's not a steady Eddie. He's not somebody I can count on. He's somebody that 5 weeks last year he scored less than 10 points, and then there were some weeks he'd score 50 points. So how do I know the week I need him to score 50 points he's not going to score me 5, and the week I don't need any points because I'm already ahead, he's going to score me 50 points and it's going to be useless. So Aaron Jones was really difficult study for me. Alright guys, hang in there, we're almost done. We're at number 9. And at number 9, I have Leonard Fournette. Statistically had 265 rushing attempts for 1,152 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. he had a lot more receptions than I thought he would. I thought he was just an in between the tackles runner, and he had stones for hands and he couldn't catch a cold. And he surprised me with 76 receptions for 522 yards. Unfortunately, he had no touchdowns. So he had the amount of receptions of maybe a wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3, but he didn't necessarily make the most of those receptions. Could it be because he was targeted right before a linebacker hit him, or dump offs just to get rid of the ball? ESPN fantasy football total points last year was 259.4. This year ESPN has him scoring 29 points less at 230.5 points in 2020. I kind of disagree with that. I feel like he could have as good of a season, if not better season this year. I feel like you would have to draft him in the second round. I don't feel like he could make it to the third. That's where I would grab him, at least in the second. In summary, he consistently gives you between 10 to 20 fantasy points per game. So he is a steady Eddie. The last guy we talked about, Aaron Jones, he was inconsistent in the amount of points he scored each week. He would score you some weeks 3 points, some weeks 50 points, where Leonard Fournette, he scored anywhere from 10 to 20 points every single week. So every time you put Leonard Fournette in the lineup, you know he'll at least give you 15 points. So that to me is a positive. I would rather have Leonard Fournette over Aaron Jones just because of the dependability factor. He only scored below 10 points 1 out of 15 weeks last year, and he will not blow up, but he will not tank either. So that goes along the steady Eddie line. And averaging 23 touches a game, I expect him to find the end zone a lot more this season. To only have 3 touchdowns on the year is ridiculous for a guy with the amount of volume he gets and his size. He should be used on the goal line or in the end zone or the red zone a lot more frequently. Maybe the Jags just can't find the red zone, but that's a different story. If he remains with the Jaguars this season and isn't traded, I can see the team trying to run him into the ground. So they tried to trade him, they couldn't find a suitor, and the asking price was too high for Leonard Fournette. So I feel like if this is going to be his last year with the team, that they might try to get every ounce of sweat out of him. They might just run him into the ground, and that'll be good for whoever drafts him. He averaged 17.66 rushing attempts per game. He averaged 76.8 rushing yards per game. And surprisingly, he averaged 5 receptions per game for 34.8 receiving yards per game, and he averaged 17.56 fantasy points per week. So every time you put him in your lineup, he's giving you 17 points, which to me is really valuable. And at number 10, I have Austin Eckler. So Austin Eckler is the exact opposite of Derrick Henry, where Derrick Henry did all of his damage, got all of his fantasy points on the ground, and was used very sparingly in the receiving game. Austin Eckler was used very sparingly in the running game, but was used an insane amount in the passing game. He has wide receiver 1 numbers as a running back. So his statistics are 132 rushing attempts for 557 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. Receiving, he had 92 receptions, 993 yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns. So he had 92 receptions, which is insane. A lot of receivers barely can get to 100 receptions a year. So for a running back to have 92 receptions in a single season is just ridiculous. And in a PPR league, that's amazing. But I just have the hardest time with him, because as a running back, I want you to average 20 rushing attempts per game, and I want you to give me 1,000 yards rushing a season and 8 touchdowns on the ground. I don't like my running backs to be a wide receiver that also kind of runs the ball here and there. In total, he scored 309 fantasy points last year, according to ESPN, and ESPN is projecting him to score quite a bit less, 70 less points in 2020, and I feel like he would have to be in the late second, early third. I don't see him lasting beyond that. I feel like what he gives you as a receiver is too valuable. I just have a hard time with him, because I like my running backs to run the ball. His outlook, his pros are he is now the lead back now that Melvin Gordon was shipped to the Broncos. He's extremely reliable in the passing game, and his volume of carries should go up with the change of quarterback, whether it's Tyrod Taylor or Justin Herbert. I feel like a read option type of offense would be perfect for both the quarterbacks and him. And you know, a lot of inexperienced quarterbacks, they tend to lean on their running backs a lot, just by running the ball first and foremost, or by checking down to them a lot. So I feel like with a change at quarterback, even though Phillip Rivers did like to target his running backs as well, but I just feel like young inexperienced quarterbacks tend to lean on their running backs a little bit more than vets. And I feel like the offensive coordinator will probably lean on the running back, or the running game in general, or the extended running game with the short passes to Austin Eckler, to kind of ease along their quarterback, whether it be Tyrod Taylor or rookie Justin Herbert. I feel like his cons are he's pulled out of the game in short yardage situations and goal line for much larger backs, so that's gonna cut down on his rushing touchdown production. So he might have an amazing game through the air and on the ground, but once they get to the goal line, they could pull him out for Joshua Kelly, who they just drafted in the 4th round, who's a bigger back. So I feel like his touchdowns might suffer because of his size, and I really would like to see his carries increase. Like, if his carries increase, his production will obviously increase. I'd like to see him used a lot more as a running back. I feel like Christian McCaffrey does it best with almost 20 carries a game and 7 receptions per game. So I feel like Austin Eckler even got halfway there, that he would be a lot more productive. He averaged only 8.25 rushing attempts per game. He only averaged 34.81 rushing yards per game, which is unfortunate. However, he did average 5.75 receptions per game and averaged 62 receiving yards per game. His total touchdowns was 11. He had 8 receiving and 3 rushing, which for most running backs, that's the opposite. They have 8 rushing touchdowns and 3 receiving touchdowns. Austin Eckler is obviously different. His average fantasy points per game was 19.68. So he had almost 20 points per game. I just had a hard time with it, because it seemed as though his points started to dwindle towards the end of the year. He had games where it was 15 points, and then next week was 10 points, and then just less than 10 points. And so I feel like he kind of fell off towards the end of the year, and I'm kind of concerned that he might not be utilized. Like, I thought that he would have a lot more opportunities in the run game due to Melvin Gordon's trade. I feel like he was going to be the new full-time workhorse back. But Melvin Gordon has a lot different body type than Austin Eckler. He's bigger. He had his injury issues, Melvin Gordon, but I feel like his body could take possibly more of a pounding than Austin Eckler with his smaller frame. And so I don't feel like Austin Eckler won't be utilized as much as Melvin Gordon in the running game between the tackles, like I would hope. So that's why I initially had Austin Eckler at 7, but I'd slide him back to 10 due to his lack of rushing. I understand that in a PPR league, who cares if he gets you 20 points per week? He gets you 20 points per week, whether it's receptions or rushing. But I just feel like if his rushing attempts and yardage stays the same, and defenses start crowding the line of scrimmage to, you know, pressure Justin Herbert or Tyrod Taylor into making a bad decision, or they blitz more frequently, or they just load guys in the box to make life hard on the quarterback, and realizing that Austin Eckler's mainly just a receiving running back, that there'll be more defenders in the box to stop screen plays or short passes to Austin Eckler. So I'm concerned if they don't use him more as a running back, that his production receiving the ball will go down quite a bit. So that's why I initially had him slotted at number 7, but I had to move him down to number 10 because of my concerns. But anyway, thank you for sticking with me the whole way. I did a lot of research on these 10 running backs, and obviously I put a lot of effort into this video, and I didn't put much effort into my background I will try and make my room more spicy for you guys. But overall, this is fun. Definitely beats landscaping in the sun all day. I really love football and I love running backs, and I feel like they're the key to having a good fantasy team. I feel like you have the best running backs in the league and okay receivers, like middle of the pack receivers and middle of the pack quarterback, you'll be fine. That's what I had last year in 2 of my leagues, and I made playoffs and I should have won the championship. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please leave a like, please share it with your friends if you found it informational or informative. Wow. And overall, thank you for watching. Thank you for hanging in there, and I will try and cut down on the runtime of these videos in the future. And just know it's hard for you to sit there and watch them. It's hard for me to make the videos and sit here and talk to a camera for an hour. So we're both learning. We're both having to do things that maybe we don't want to do. But hopefully the knowledge helps you win your fantasy league this year. So that's what matters to me. And also, if you could hit that like button, that would mean the world to me. Thank you very much. My name is Justin Medeiros III. This is my fantasy football advice for my top 10 running backs, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.